The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with lawyers in fancy suits carrying expensive briefcases. Their voices echoed off the shiny floors as they talked and laughed. Sarah Martinez stood near the wall, trying not to be noticed. In her hands, she held a cheap plastic folder from the dollar store. Inside were papers she'd printed at the library, some of them wrinkled because the copy machine had jammed. Sarah wore her nicest outfit, black pants she'd bought 6 years ago for a job interview and a white shirt she'd ironed that morning until her hands hurt. She wanted to look professional, but standing next to all these lawyers in their $1,000 suits, she felt like she didn't belong. Next to her stood her son, Marcus. He was 12 years old and held his backpack close to his chest like it contained treasure. While other kids his age were probably at school playing basketball or trading cards at lunch, Marcus was here. He didn't complain or ask to leave. He just watched everything with quiet, serious eyes. Sarah looked down at him and tried to smile, even though she felt sick to her stomach. "You doing okay, sweetie?" Marcus nodded once. His eyes followed a lawyer walking past them, noticing how confident the man looked, how he held his head high like he owned the place. "I'm fine, Mom," Marcus said quietly. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that today would somehow turn out okay. But the nervous feeling in her stomach told her this was going to be bad. Really bad. 3 months ago, life had been hard but manageable. Sarah worked mornings doing computer work at a doctor's office in downtown Chicago, entering patient information and scheduling appointments. In the afternoons, she cleaned office buildings. Sometimes she worked evenings waitressing at a diner if they needed extra help. It was exhausting work, but it was hers. She'd built this life after Marcus's father died in a car accident when Marcus was only 3 years old. Then the letter arrived. It came in a thick envelope from a law firm. Sarah remembered opening it at their kitchen table, her hands shaking as she read words that didn't make sense: fraud, falsifying records, theft of patient information, insurance scheme. The letter said she had stolen information from patients. It said she had changed billing codes to steal money from insurance companies. It said she had damaged the medical practice where she worked and that they wanted her to pay them money, lots of money. Money she didn't have and hadn't stolen. More letters came after that. Then official court papers. Notices about hearings she had to attend. Papers with confusing words like plaintiff and defendant and civil litigation. The doctors at the practice where she'd worked, Chicago Family Medical Center, were suing her. They claimed she'd cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars through fraud. They wanted her to pay them back, plus penalties, plus their lawyer fees. Sarah tried to get help. She called legal aid offices, but they told her they had too many cases already or that her case was too complicated for them to handle. She went to 3 different lawyers for consultations. All of them said the same thing: they need a retainer fee, money paid up front, of at least $10,000 just to start working on her case. $10,000 might as well have been $10 million. Sarah didn't have that kind of money. One lawyer seemed sympathetic. A nice woman named Mrs. Chen who really wanted to help. But 2 weeks later, Mrs. Chen called back sadly. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. My law firm has business connections to Chicago Family Medical. There's a conflict of interest. I'm not allowed to represent you." Sarah's savings disappeared fast. An eviction notice arrived the same week she got another court filing. She had to choose, pay rent or pay lawyers. She chose to keep a roof over Marcus's head. She chose to buy groceries and keep the electricity on and get Marcus a winter coat because his old one didn't fit anymore. Now here she stood in the courthouse in downtown Chicago, surrounded by people who belonged here, about to represent herself in a legal case she barely understood against opponents who did this for a living. At home in their small apartment on the South Side, their life told a story. The kitchen table was always covered in paperwork now, legal documents Sarah tried to read every night. The TV in the living room flickered sometimes, but Marcus had figured out how to fix it by tapping it in just the right spot. Their furniture came from donation centers and things people left on the street. Sarah would clean them up and repair them to make them work. But there were other details too. Books everywhere. Thick, heavy books from the library about history, science, law, and government. These weren't kid books with pictures and simple stories. These were adult books with tiny print and big words. Marcus checked them out himself while Sarah worked. He'd take the bus to the Harold Washington Library after school and spend hours reading. He read methodically, carefully, sometimes asking Sarah questions she couldn't answer. "Mom, what does jurisdiction mean? Mom, if someone accuses you of something without proof, can they really take you to court?" Sarah hadn't realized at first that Marcus wasn't just curious. He was preparing. He was getting ready for this fight. In the evenings, Marcus would go through Sarah's court papers. He'd read each page slowly, carefully, then rearrange the documents. When Sarah asked what he was doing, he'd say simply, "I'm trying to understand." She'd find him watching videos at the library, recordings of real trials, explanations of legal concepts, even lectures from law school professors that were available online for free. Their relationship had always been close. After Marcus's father died, it had been just the two of them against the world. But lately, Marcus seemed older somehow. More serious. His silence felt purposeful, like he was constantly thinking about things he didn't say out loud. Sarah worried he was growing up too fast. She worried he was absorbing too much stress, carrying weight no 12-year-old should have to carry. When she cried at night, thinking he was asleep in his room, Marcus was actually awake. The walls in their apartment were thin. He could hear everything. He felt every ounce of her pain. The week before court, Sarah had practiced what she would say. She stood in their tiny living room, reading from shaky, handwritten notes. "Your Honor, I would like to state for the record that I have never engaged in fraudulent activity, and I believe this case is based on a misunderstanding." Marcus looked up from his homework. "Mom, you should say I respectfully submit instead. And you need to reference which specific claims you're addressing." "What?" "The complaint has 4 different accusations against you. You need to address each one separately, not just make a general denial." "How do you know that?" He shrugged. "The civil procedure rules. I read them at the library." Sarah stared at her son. He was 12 years old. How did he know about civil procedure rules? The night before court, they organized documents at the kitchen table. Sarah kept sorting them, first by date, then by topic, then by what seemed most important. She was never quite sure what order made sense. Marcus watched quietly, then gently started rearranging everything. "Baby, I just organized those," Sarah said, exhausted. "I know, but they should be in the order the court will ask for them. Original complaint first, then your response, then their amended complaint, then evidence exhibits by number, not by what's in them." Sarah had been too tired to argue. She watched his small hands work with careful precision, creating a system that looked more professional than anything she could have managed. Now, standing in the courthouse hallway, she felt the full weight of what was coming. The woman at the information desk had looked at her with pity when Sarah asked where to go. "You're representing yourself?" the clerk had asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you have any legal training?" "No, ma'am." The clerk's expression said everything. "You're going to lose. You don't stand a chance." They stood outside courtroom 4B now. People filed past them, lawyers greeting each other, paralegals pushing carts full of files, courthouse staff moving efficiently through their workday. Someone bumped into Sarah without apologizing. She was invisible here. Marcus's hand found hers. "We should go in, Mom." Sarah nodded and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, but no less intimidating. Wooden benches faced the judge's elevated platform at the front. At one table sat 3 people in expensive suits, arranging laptops and files with practiced ease. Sarah moved to the empty table on the other side and set down her dollar store folder. Marcus sat in the bench right behind her, his backpack in his lap, watching everything with those serious, observant eyes. More people filed into the courtroom. Some took seats in the gallery to watch. Others spoke in hushed tones near the bailiff's desk. Sarah caught fragments of conversation, legal terms she didn't understand, references to cases and precedents and motions. At the opposing table, One of the lawyers glanced over at Sarah. The woman was in her 40s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from winning cases. Her eyes swept over Sarah's cheap folder, her department store clothes, her obvious nervousness. Then the lawyer's gaze moved to Marcus, and something flickered across her face. Curiosity, maybe? Or amusement. The lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her colleagues. One of them looked at Sarah and smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a cat that had cornered a mouse. Sarah's stomach turned over. She'd known this would be hard. She hadn't realized how much worse it would feel to be looked at like she was entertainment, like her life falling apart was something amusing to watch. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice cut through the room. Everyone stood as the judge entered, a white man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. He took his seat behind the bench and reviewed some papers while the bailiff called the case. Case number 47289, Chicago Family Medical Center vs. Sarah Martinez. Counsel, please state your appearances. The lead opposing lawyer stood smoothly. Jennifer Morrison on behalf of the plaintiff, Chicago Family Medical Center, Your Honor. With me are associates David Chen and Emily Rodriguez. The judge nodded and made a note. Then he looked at Sarah's table. And for the defendant? Sarah stood slowly. Her chair scraped against the floor, the sound too loud in the formal space. Sarah Martinez, Your Honor. I'm representing myself. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, someone coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Another person whispered something. A lawyer in the front row smirked at his companion. The judge removed his glasses and studied Sarah with an expression that managed to be both concerned and skeptical. Miss Martinez, you're appearing pro se? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah had learned that pro se meant representing yourself. Do you have any legal training or education? No, Your Honor. Are you aware this is a complex civil litigation case involving multiple claims of fraud, breach of contract, and regulatory violations? I'm aware of the charges, Your Honor. And you've been unable to secure legal representation? Sarah felt her face grow hot. Everyone was staring at her. The lawyers at the opposing table were watching with obvious interest. The gallery had gone quiet, people leaning forward to hear better. I couldn't afford a lawyer, Your Honor. More whispers rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back made a sound that might have been sympathy or might have been mockery. Sarah couldn't tell anymore. Her vision had started to blur at the edges. Her breathing felt shallow. Judge Anderson, she could see his nameplate now, removed his glasses and studied her carefully. Miss Martinez, I'm going to be very direct with you. This court strongly advises defendants to seek legal counsel in cases of this complexity. The opposing party has experienced litigation attorneys. The legal standards are technical. The consequences of losing could be severe. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. I don't think you do. His voice was firm but not unkind. If you proceed without counsel, you'll be held to the same standards as an attorney. The court cannot provide you with legal advice. You'll be expected to know procedure, evidence rules, how to file motions, how to examine witnesses, how to present your case properly. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. I don't have a choice, Your Honor. Complete silence filled the courtroom. The judge glanced at Marcus, and his expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Very well. The court will proceed with your pro se representation. However, I'm ordering a continuance of 2 weeks to give you time to reconsider and make one final attempt to find counsel. Jennifer Morrison stood immediately. Your Honor, the plaintiff opposes any continuance. This case has already been delayed multiple times due to the defendant's inability to secure counsel. I'm granting the continuance. The judge's tone left no room for argument. 2 weeks. Use them wisely, Miss Martinez. He struck his gavel, and just like that, the hearing was over. Sarah gathered her folder with shaking hands. Around her, the courtroom emptied quickly. Lawyers moved on to their next cases. Gallery members filed out to wherever they needed to be. She felt frozen, unable to move, unable to think about what had just happened. A hand touched her shoulder gently. She turned to find the court clerk, an older black woman with kind eyes and deep lines around her mouth that suggested she'd seen a lot in her years working here. "Honey," the woman said softly, "there's a legal aid office 2 blocks from here. Sometimes they take walk-ins on Thursday mornings. It's worth trying." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. The clerk squeezed her shoulder once, then moved away to help the bailiff organize papers. Outside the courtroom, Sarah finally let herself breathe. The hallway was still crowded, but most people were too busy to notice her. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, trying to stop the shaking that had spread from her hands to her entire body. "Mom?" Elijah stood in front of her, his backpack still clutched in both hands. He didn't look upset or scared. He looked thoughtful, like he was processing everything he just witnessed. "Yeah, baby? That lawyer, the main one, she made 3 statements about your case that don't match what's in the complaint documents." Sarah opened her eyes. "What?" "When she was talking to the judge before we went in, I heard her tell him this case was about systematic fraud over 18 months. But the complaint says 6 months. And she said you accessed confidential files, but the original charge was about billing codes. And she mentioned witness testimony, but there's no witness list in any of the papers you showed me." Sarah stared at her son, amazed. "You remember all that?" "I was listening." He said it simply, like it was obvious, like any 12-year-old would have tracked every detail of the opposing counsel's statements and cross-referenced them with legal documents in his head. She wanted to ask how he knew to do that, where he'd learned to pay attention to those kinds of details. But a group of lawyers walked past them, talking loudly about lunch plans, and Sarah suddenly needed to get out of this building. She needed air and space and a moment to fall apart where no one could see her. The 2 weeks between hearings vanished in a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. Sarah's morning shift at a new medical office. She'd been fired from Chicago Family Medical the day they filed the lawsuit, barely covered rent. Her afternoon cleaning job left her hands raw and aching. Evenings were consumed by court documents spread across the kitchen table, with Marcus translating legal language into words she could understand. The stress ground her down visibly. At work, she made mistakes, wrong codes entered, forgotten tasks, missed appointments. Her supervisor, Mrs. Jameson, pulled her aside one day with concern that looked like pity. "Sarah, is everything okay? You seem distracted." "I'm fine. Just some personal issues." Mrs. Jameson looked like she wanted to say more but didn't. Meanwhile, teachers called about Marcus. He was distracted in class, they said. He kept correcting teachers' grammar and asking questions about constitutional law during history lessons. The school counselor gently suggested a behavioral evaluation. Sarah felt like she was failing at everything. The opposing side filed motion after motion, thick packets of legal arguments Sarah had to somehow answer. They requested additional discovery, which Marcus explained meant more questions she had to respond to. They filed amended complaints with new allegations. They submitted expert witness declarations, fancy statements from doctors saying Sarah had definitely committed fraud. Every document felt like another weight on an already impossible pile. Sarah tried to respond properly. She spent lunch breaks at the Chicago Public Library, searching for case law on the computer, reading legal blogs, watching YouTube videos about court procedures. A courthouse clerk named James had given her some templates and explained basic formatting. But even with his help, she felt like she was building a sandcastle against an incoming tide. The first real hearing arrived on a cold October morning. Sarah and Marcus rode the bus in silence, both carrying backpacks with carefully organized documents. The courtroom felt different this time, more tense. The gallery had fewer casual observers and more invested parties. Sarah recognized her former boss, Dr. Richard Brennan, sitting in the back row. 2 people she didn't know sat near the front, taking notes. Reporters maybe, or law students. Jennifer Morrison arrived with her full team, plus a 4th lawyer Sarah hadn't seen before, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of someone very important. They set up at their table with military precision, laptops glowing, documents arranged in perfect stacks. Sarah took her seat and tried to project confidence she didn't feel. Behind her, Marcus sat perfectly still, his eyes tracking every movement in the courtroom with laser focus. Judge Anderson entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. The judge reviewed his notes before looking up with an expression that suggested this hearing would be more substantial than the last. "We're here today to address the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment," he began. "This motion argues that there are no genuine disputes of material fact and that the plaintiff is entitled to judgment as a matter of law. Miss Morrison, you may present your arguments." Morrison stood and launched into a polished presentation. She cited case law, referenced Sarah's discovery responses, pointed to alleged inconsistencies. She argued that the evidence clearly showed Sarah had accessed patient files without authorization, altered billing codes to inflate insurance payments, and knowingly participated in fraud. Her arguments flowed smoothly, each point building on the last. She used a PowerPoint presentation with timelines and spreadsheets that made Sarah's actions look calculated and deliberate. The silver-haired lawyer occasionally whispered adjustments. When Morrison finished, the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of her arguments. "Miss Martinez, you may respond to the plaintiff's motion." Sarah stood, her legs shaky. She looked down at her notes, carefully written points Marcus had helped her organize. Her mouth felt dry. "Your Honor, I respectfully submit that the plaintiff's motion mischaracterizes both the evidence and my role at Chicago Family Medical." Her voice sounded thin compared to Morrison's confident presentation, but she pressed forward, reading from her notes. "The plaintiff claims I accessed patient files without authorization. But as a data entry clerk, I was required to access these files to perform my job duties. The employee manual, which I've submitted as Exhibit C in my opposition papers, specifically lists file access as part of my responsibilities." Sarah saw Morrison's associate lean over and whisper something. Morrison's expression tightened slightly. "The plaintiff also claims I altered billing codes. But the evidence shows that I entered codes provided to me by supervising physicians and billing managers. I did not generate these codes independently, and I had no training in medical coding that would enable me to know if codes were correct or incorrect." She was following the script Marcus had helped her develop, addressing each point systematically. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of paper as Marcus flipped through documents. "Your Honor, there's a procedural issue I need to raise." Sarah paused. That wasn't in her notes. She glanced back at Marcus, who was holding up a paper and pointing to a specific paragraph. Her heart raced. They practiced this moment, but doing it in real time felt terrifying. "The plaintiff's motion cites a declaration from Dr. Richard Brennan, who claims he never authorized certain billing codes I allegedly entered. But Dr. Brennan is listed as an associate attorney for the plaintiff's law firm. His last name matches one of the lawyers at counsel table, David Brennan." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Anderson looked up sharply. "Miss Martinez, are you suggesting the witness is related to opposing counsel?" "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that a witness declaration from someone who shares a last name with the plaintiff's attorney, and who is listed as a party with financial interest in the medical practice, might have credibility issues. The declaration should at minimum disclose this relationship." Morrison stood immediately. "Your Honor, Dr. Brennan is a licensed physician with 20 years of experience. His relationship to our firm is irrelevant to the medical facts he's attesting to." "The relationship is absolutely relevant to bias, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "And the failure to disclose it in the declaration violates the disclosure requirements under the civil procedure rules." Judge Anderson removed his glasses and studied the declaration in question. The courtroom had gone completely silent. "Ms. Morrison, is the witness related to your associate, Mr. David Chen?" There was a pause. Morrison looked uncomfortable. "He's his uncle, Your Honor." "But... And does Dr. Brennan have a financial stake in Chicago Family Medical?" "He's a partner in the practice, Your Honor, but that doesn't." "Ms. Morrison, these are relationships that should have been disclosed in the declaration. The court is troubled by this omission. For the first time since the case began, Sarah saw cracks in the opposing team's facade. The associate lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Morrison's jaw tightened. Your Honor, we can provide a supplemental declaration that the motion currently before me relies on this declaration as key evidence. Judge Anderson interrupted. Without it, your motion lacks sufficient support for the claims you're making about Ms. Martinez's knowledge and intent. Sarah felt something flutter in her chest. Not victory, she was too experienced with disappointment to call it that. But possibility. I'm going to deny the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment. Judge Anderson continued. However, Miss Martinez, you should understand this doesn't mean you've won your case. It simply means there are genuine disputes of fact that need to be resolved at trial. The plaintiff may refile with proper disclosures and additional evidence. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you. As she sat down, Sarah's hands trembled. She'd survived. She'd found something real, and it had made a difference. Behind her, Marcus quietly closed his notebook. Outside the courtroom, Sarah leaned against the wall, processing what had happened. They hadn't won, but they hadn't lost either. For the first time, the opposing side looked uncertain. Jennifer Morrison walked past without making eye contact, her team in urgent conversation. The silver-haired lawyer looked displeased. James, the helpful courthouse clerk, approached with a cautious smile. That was well done. Catching that disclosure issue probably saved your case. My son caught it, Sarah said quietly. James glanced at Marcus. How old is he? 12. He reads documents like a lawyer who's been practicing for years. That evening, instead of relief, Sarah felt the pressure intensifying. The opposing side would regroup. The trial date was set for 2 months away, and every day brought new challenges. Elijah seemed to sense her spiraling thoughts. At the kitchen table, surrounded by documents, he spoke quietly. Mom, they're going to try something different now. They know we're actually reading their filings. What do you think they'll do? They'll try to overwhelm us. File a lot of motions at once, make us respond to everything simultaneously. They'll hope we miss something or make a mistake under pressure. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison's firm filed 6 separate motions, requests to exclude evidence, motions to compel testimony, procedural objections. Each motion required a response. Each response had a different deadline. The paperwork avalanche was clearly designed to drown Sarah in complexity. But Marcus created a chart tracking every motion, every deadline, every required element of their responses. He broke down each filing into simple questions. What are they asking for? Why are they asking? What's the weakness in their argument? They worked late into the nights. Sarah writing responses while Marcus researched and organized. Sometimes he'd point out inconsistencies between different motions, showing her how the opposing side's own arguments contradicted each other. At school, Marcus's teachers called again. He was falling asleep in class. His grades were slipping. The counselor used words like trauma response and coping mechanisms, and suggested Sarah consider therapy for him. Sarah felt crushed by guilt. Her 12-year-old son shouldn't be fighting legal battles. He should be playing video games, hanging out with friends, being a child. Instead, he was sacrificing his education and childhood to save her. Baby, maybe we should stop, she said one night, watching him struggle to stay awake over a legal brief. Maybe I should just take their settlement offer. This is too much for you. Earlier that week, Morrison had approached them with an offer: plead guilty to negligent record-keeping, pay a $10,000 fine, and accept a 5-year ban from working in medical offices. No jail time. Marcus looked up at her with eyes that seemed far older than 12. Mom, if you take the settlement, you admit guilt for something you didn't do. You pay money we don't have. You lose your ability to work in your field. And everyone will think you were a criminal who got a deal. Is that what you want? I want you to be okay. I am okay. I'm learning important things. He paused. And I'm not going to let them win just because they have more money and more lawyers. That's not how justice is supposed to work. Sarah pulled him into a hug, feeling tears slide down her face. Her son had somehow developed a moral code that wouldn't bend, even under impossible pressure. The breakthrough came during a hearing Sarah had almost written off as routine. It was a motion about witness testimony, boring, procedural, unlikely to change anything significant. Sarah presented her opposition, arguing that public records were admissible and relevant. Her delivery had improved over the past month. She no longer shook when she spoke, no longer stumbled over legal terms. She was learning by doing, by surviving, by refusing to give up. But it was during her argument that something unexpected happened. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims my public records request was improper," Sarah said. "But I followed the exact procedures outlined in Illinois' open records law. I submitted my request in writing, paid the processing fee, and received these documents from the Cook County Clerk's office. The plaintiff can't now claim these official records are somehow inadmissible just because they don't like what the records show." Morrison stood to respond. "Your Honor, the issue isn't whether the records are authentic. It's whether they're relevant to this case. Miss Martinez obtained corporate filings and financial records for Chicago Family Medical, but those records don't prove anything about her specific conduct. They prove context, Your Honor," Sarah countered. "They show that Chicago Family Medical was facing serious financial difficulties during the time period when I supposedly committed fraud. They show that the practice had been investigated by state regulators for billing irregularities before I was even hired." That was true. Marcus had found it buried in hundreds of pages of Illinois Department of Public Health records. The medical practice had been flagged for problematic billing patterns 2 years before Sarah started working there. "Your Honor, the financial state of the practice is irrelevant to whether—" "It's completely relevant," Sarah interrupted, then caught herself. "I apologize for interrupting, Your Honor, but the plaintiff's entire case is based on the theory that I caused financial harm to Chicago Family Medical through fraudulent billing. If the practice was already under investigation for billing problems before I was hired, that directly contradicts their theory of harm." Judge Anderson looked intrigued. "Ms. Morrison, were you aware that Chicago Family Medical had prior regulatory issues?" "Your Honor, the practice had a routine audit that resulted in some minor corrections, but the state investigation found systematic billing irregularities and imposed a corrective action plan," Sarah said, reading from the document Marcus had helped her find. "That's in the records I'm seeking to admit. It's not minor, and it's directly relevant to whether my conduct caused the problems they're blaming me for." The judge leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to allow Miss Martinez's evidence. The prior regulatory issues with Chicago Family Medical are relevant to causation and to the credibility of the plaintiff's damages claims." Motion denied. As they left the courthouse that day, Sarah felt something shift. They hadn't just survived another hearing. They'd actively damaged the opposing side's narrative. For the first time, they were playing offense instead of defense. But that night, reality crashed back in. Sarah came home to find an eviction notice taped to their apartment door. 3 months behind on rent. 30 days to pay or vacate. She stood in the hallway holding the notice, feeling the last of her hope crumble. She'd been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months, skipping rent to pay court filing fees, skipping electricity payments to afford bus fare to hearings. Now the whole fragile structure was collapsing. Marcus found her sitting on the floor outside their apartment door, the eviction notice in her lap, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to lose everything," she whispered. "Even if we win the case, we're going to lose our home." He sat down next to her, his small shoulder pressing against hers. For a moment, he was just a 12-year-old boy sitting with his mother while she fell apart. Then he spoke quietly. "Mom, do you remember what you told me when Dad died?" She shook her head. "You said we'd survive because we had each other. You said as long as we were together, we could handle anything. You said home wasn't a place, it was us." Sarah let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "I can't believe you remember that. You were so little. I remember everything you taught me. Every night you came home exhausted and still helped with homework. Every time you went without so I could have what I needed. Every sacrifice you thought I didn't notice, I noticed all of it, Mom. And that's why I'm not going to let them break us now. She looked at her son, this child who'd somehow become her anchor, her strategist, her partner in survival. We're going to win this case, he said with quiet certainty. And when we do, we'll fix everything else. But right now, we just need to keep fighting. Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. They went inside and returned to the kitchen table, to the documents and deadlines that had become their life. Over the next 3 weeks, they developed a routine that was equal parts desperation and determination. Sarah worked every shift she could get, sometimes pulling doubles. Marcus managed their legal strategy with increasing sophistication. He'd created a timeline of every event in the case, cross-referenced with every document, finding patterns and contradictions the opposing side had hoped would stay buried. He discovered that several of the fraudulent billing codes Sarah had supposedly entered were actually standard codes that had been approved by insurance companies. He found emails in the discovery materials showing that Chicago Family Medical's billing manager had instructed Sarah to use specific codes, the same codes they were now claiming were fraudulent. "Mom, look at this," Marcus said one evening, his voice vibrating with excitement. He spread out several documents on the kitchen table. "In their third amended complaint, they claim you acted alone. But in their response to our discovery, they list 4 other employees who had access to the same billing system. And in the state investigation records, those employees were the ones specifically flagged for problematic billing, not you." Sarah studied the documents he'd laid out. "You're saying I wasn't even the person the state investigators were concerned about?" "Exactly. You were hired after the investigation started. The employees who were actually under scrutiny still work there. But you're the one they're blaming because I'm the one who can't fight back," Sarah finished. Or at least, that's what they thought. The next court hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Morrison had filed a motion that seemed designed to end the case once and for all. She was claiming that Sarah had spoliated evidence, destroyed documents that were relevant to the case. Sarah was terrified. She hadn't destroyed anything. She'd kept every email, every document, every scrap of paper from her time at Chicago Family Medical. But the accusation itself was serious enough to potentially get her case dismissed and result in sanctions. Marcus spent 3 days preparing their response. He went through every piece of evidence they had, creating a detailed log that showed Sarah had preserved everything. He found the employee handbook that showed Sarah's email account had been deleted by the IT department within 24 hours of her termination, before she even knew she'd be sued, before she had any legal obligation to preserve evidence. At the hearing, Morrison presented her spoliation motion with dramatic flair, arguing that Sarah's convenient inability to produce certain emails proved she'd destroyed evidence. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood with the detailed evidence log Marcus had prepared. "Your Honor, I did not destroy any evidence. The plaintiff terminated my employment and immediately revoked my access to all company systems, including my email account. Their own IT records, which I've obtained through discovery, show that standard company policy is to delete terminated employees' email accounts within 24 hours. I had no opportunity to preserve those emails because the company deleted them before I was even aware I'd be sued." She submitted the evidence log, the IT policy documents, the timeline showing the deletion happened before any litigation hold could have applied. Judge Anderson reviewed the materials carefully. "Ms. Morrison, it appears the plaintiff's own policies resulted in the destruction of these emails, not any action by Miss Martinez. Your Honor, she could have. Could have what? Predicted she'd be sued and somehow preserved emails from a system she no longer had access to? That's not a reasonable expectation. Motion for spoliation is denied." Another crack in the opposing side's case. Another moment where their overwhelming advantage shrank just slightly. As they left the courthouse, Sarah noticed something new in how people looked at them. The whispers weren't just about the woman foolish enough to represent herself. Some people looked curious. Others looked impressed. A law student approached them in the hallway. "Excuse me, Miss Martinez? I'm writing a paper about pro-se litigation. Would you be willing to be interviewed about your experience?" Sarah politely declined. But the request itself felt significant. They were becoming something neither of them had planned, an example of resistance, a story of someone refusing to be crushed. That night, working at the kitchen table that had become their war room, Marcus showed Sarah something that made her heart stop. "Mom, I found something in the financial records. Something big." He spread out 3 different documents: the State Investigation Report, Chicago Family Medical's financial statements, and the plaintiff's complaint in their case. The state investigation found $200,000 in improper billing over 2 years. Chicago Family Medical's financial statements show they paid a $150,000 settlement to the state to resolve the investigation. But in this case, they're claiming $200,000 in damages that you supposedly caused. Sarah stared at the numbers. "They're claiming I caused the same damages they already paid to settle the state investigation." "It looks like it. They're trying to recover from you what they paid to the state for problems that existed before you were even hired." "That's fraud," Marcus said quietly. "They're committing fraud while accusing you of fraud." Sarah felt a chill run through her. This wasn't just about defending herself anymore. If what Marcus had found was accurate, Chicago Family Medical was using the court system to recoup losses from their own misconduct by blaming a convenient scapegoat, a Latina single mother with no resources to fight back. "We need to be sure about this," Sarah said. "If we're going to accuse them of fraud, we need to be absolutely certain." "I am certain. Look at the dates. Look at the amounts. Look at the specific billing codes listed in the state investigation versus the codes they claim you fraudulently used. They're identical." Sarah pulled her son into a fierce hug. "You brilliant, amazing boy. You found it. You actually found it. We found it, Mom. We found it together." The next morning, Sarah filed a motion that changed everything. With Marcus's research organized into an exhibit that laid out the evidence clearly, she argued that Chicago Family Medical had misrepresented material facts to the court. She requested that the judge order the production of all documents related to the state investigation and the settlement agreement. Morrison's response came within hours instead of the usual days. It was angry, defensive, and, most tellingly, vague about the specific allegations Sarah had raised. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing. As Sarah and Marcus prepared for what might be the most important hearing yet, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since this nightmare began: hope. Real, genuine hope. They sat at the kitchen table the night before the hearing, reviewing their materials one final time. The apartment was silent except for the sound of papers rustling and Marcus's pencil scratching notes. "Mom," he said suddenly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." She looked up at him. "You taught me that standing up for what's right matters more than whether it's easy or hard. You showed me that every single day. That's why I know we're going to win. Not because we're smarter or better, but because we're telling the truth, and they're not." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from you." The next morning, they walked into the courthouse together. The gallery was packed. Word had spread about the case, about the pro-SE defendant who was somehow holding her own against a major law firm. Jennifer Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with her full team, but their usual confidence had been replaced by visible tension. Judge Anderson entered, and everyone rose. "We're here regarding Miss Martinez's motion concerning potential misrepresentation of material facts," he began. "This is a serious allegation, and I've reviewed the supporting documents carefully. Miss Morrison, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond, but I want specific answers about the relationship between the state investigation and the damages claimed in this case." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed on the judge. "Ms. Morrison, before I hear from Miss Martinez, I want to give you an opportunity to address these allegations directly. Does Chicago Family Medical have a settlement agreement with the state related to billing irregularities?" Morrison stood slowly. For the first time since the case began, she looked uncertain. "Your Honor, yes, the medical practice did enter into a settlement with the Illinois Department of Public Health approximately 3 years ago. However, And did that settlement involve payment of approximately $150,000 to resolve allegations of improper billing practices? Yes, Your Honor, but the settlement was for different billing issues then. Ms. Morrison, I've reviewed the state investigation report that Ms. Martinez obtained through public records requests. The billing codes identified in that investigation appear to be substantially similar to the codes at issue in this case. Can you explain why your complaint doesn't mention the prior investigation or the settlement? Morrison glanced at her associates, then back to the judge. Your Honor, we didn't believe the prior investigation was relevant to Ms. Martinez's individual conduct. You didn't believe it was relevant that your client had a history of billing problems before Ms. Martinez was even hired? The judge's tone had taken on an edge Sarah had never heard before. You didn't think it might be material that you're seeking damages that appear to overlap substantially with losses your client already recovered through a state settlement? Your Honor, if I may explain. I'd like to hear from Miss Martinez first. Judge Anderson turned to Sarah. Miss Martinez, please present your evidence. Sarah stood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Every sleepless night, every skipped meal to afford filing fees, every hour Marcus had spent studying instead of being a child, it all came down to this. Your Honor, I've prepared a timeline that I believe tells the complete story. She approached the bench with copies for the judge and opposing counsel, then returned to her table where Marcus had the visual aids they'd created ready. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She'd earned this moment through months of survival and determination. In May 2020, the Illinois Department of Public Health began investigating Chicago Family Medical for systematic billing irregularities. Their investigation identified approximately $200,000 in improper billing over a 2-year period. The specific billing codes flagged by investigators are listed in Exhibit A of my motion. She held up a document with the relevant codes highlighted. In December 2020, Chicago Family Medical settled with the state, agreeing to pay $150,000 and implement corrective measures. The settlement agreement, which is a public record, is Exhibit B. Another document displayed. In March 2021, 4 months after the settlement, I was hired as a data entry clerk. My job was to enter billing codes provided to me by supervising physicians and the billing manager. I was not trained in medical coding and had no authority to generate or approve codes independently. My employee file and job description are Exhibit C. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. In August 2022, I was terminated without explanation. Within 24 hours, my email account and system access were deleted per standard company policy. In September 2022, Chicago Family Medical filed this lawsuit, claiming I had committed $200,000 in fraudulent billing using the exact same codes that were identified in the state investigation, before I was even employed there. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. A reporter in the back row was typing furiously. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Chicago Family Medical is attempting to recover from me the financial losses they incurred from their own prior misconduct. They're using me as a scapegoat to recoup what they paid the state, targeting me because I'm a single mother with limited resources who they assumed couldn't defend herself. Sarah paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. I've included in my exhibits the declarations of 2 former Chicago Family Medical employees who left the practice after the state investigation. Both attest that the billing problems predated my employment and that the billing manager specifically instructed multiple employees, including me, to use the codes now claimed to be fraudulent. These are the same codes the state had already flagged. She submitted the declarations, documents Marcus had helped her obtain by tracking down former employees through public records and social media. Your Honor, I'm not asking you to rule on the merits of the entire case today. I'm asking you to consider whether Chicago Family Medical has been honest with this court about the origins of the billing problems they're blaming me for, and whether allowing this case to proceed would make me pay twice for their mistakes, once as the scapegoat, and again as the victim of their fraud. Sarah sat down, her hands trembling slightly but her spine straight. Behind her, she heard Marcus let out a quiet breath. Judge Anderson studied the documents before him, his expression darkening with each page he reviewed. The silence in the courtroom stretched until it felt almost unbearable. Finally, he looked up at Morrison. "Ms. Morrison, I'm going to ask you directly, and I want a clear answer. Did you know about the state investigation and settlement when you filed this complaint?" Morrison stood again, and this time Sarah could see sweat at her hairline. "Your Honor, we were aware of the prior investigation, but we believed." "That's not what I asked." "Did you know about it when you drafted the complaint?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you chose not to disclose it to the court?" "We didn't believe it was material to." "You didn't believe that a prior state investigation finding $200,000 in billing irregularities using the same codes was material to a case where you're claiming Miss Martinez caused $200,000 in damages using those same codes?" The judge's voice had turned cold. "You didn't think the court or opposing counsel should know that your client had already been sanctioned for these exact practices?" "Your Honor, with respect, the investigation looked at a broader pattern. A broader pattern that includes the specific conduct you're now attributing solely to Ms. Martinez." Judge Anderson set down the documents with a sharp sound. "Ms. Morrison, I'm deeply troubled by what I'm seeing here. This appears to be a calculated attempt to hold Ms. Martinez liable for losses your client already recovered through a state settlement. That's not just misleading, it may constitute fraud upon this court." The gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters were now openly typing on laptops. The attorneys observing from the back looked stunned. "Your Honor, if we could request a brief recess to—" "I want answers now." The judge leaned forward. "Do you have any evidence that Miss Martinez personally engaged in fraudulent billing that was separate and distinct from the practices identified in the state investigation?" Morrison consulted with her associates in desperate whispers. Finally, she turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we would need time to review our evidence in light of—" "That's not an answer, Ms. Morrison. After 6 months of litigation, after filing a 50-page complaint, after conducting extensive discovery, you should be able to tell me right now whether you have specific evidence of wrongdoing by Miss Martinez that's independent of the billing problems your client was already sanctioned for by the state." The silence that followed was deafening. "I see." Judge Anderson's expression was one of profound disappointment. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm ordering Chicago Family Medical to produce all documents related to the state investigation and settlement within 48 hours. I'm also ordering depositions of the Chicago Family Medical billing manager and the physician supervisors who allegedly gave instructions to Miss Martinez. And I'm seriously considering sanctions for failure to disclose material information to this court." He paused. "Furthermore, Miss Martinez, I'm not dismissing the case entirely yet, but I'm staying all proceedings pending a thorough investigation into these allegations. If the evidence supports your claims, this court will take appropriate action, which may include dismissal with prejudice and referral for investigation of fraudulent conduct." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't victory, not complete victory, but it was vindication. It was the court finally seeing what she and Marcus had spent months trying to prove. "One more thing," Judge Anderson added. "Miss Martinez, I'm going to say something I don't typically say in open court. Your work on this case has been extraordinary. The research, the document analysis, the legal arguments, they're at a level I'd expect from experienced counsel. How you've managed this while representing yourself is remarkable." His eyes moved to Marcus. "And I suspect you've had some help from a very intelligent young man." Marcus met the judge's gaze steadily but said nothing. "This hearing is adjourned. I'll issue a written order by end of day." As the gavel struck, the courtroom exploded into conversation. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Law students clustered together in animated discussion, phones out, already posting about what they'd witnessed. Several attorneys approached Sarah, offering congratulations and business cards, wanting to know her story. Jennifer Morrison and her team packed up their materials in grim silence, and left through a side exit without looking at anyone. The confidence that had once defined them had completely evaporated, replaced by the shame of being publicly exposed. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, trying to process what had just happened. Months of terror, of expecting to lose everything, of preparing for the worst, and now the judge was ordering investigations of the people who'd attacked her. Now the opposition was fleeing in disgrace. Now strangers were treating her with respect and admiration. "Mom," Marcus said quietly, "we should go." They gathered their materials and made their way toward the exit. James, the clerk who'd helped them from the beginning, intercepted them in the hallway. "Miss Martinez, that was incredible. I've worked in this courthouse for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened in there. I couldn't have done it without help," Sarah said, her voice shaky. James looked at Marcus with open admiration. "Young man, I don't know where you learned to analyze legal documents like that, but you have a gift. A real gift." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied politely. As they walked toward the exit, a reporter approached. "Miss Martinez, could I ask you a few questions about—" "No comment," Sarah said firmly, steering Marcus past the reporter. "Not today." They rode the bus home in silence, both processing the magnitude of what had happened. When they finally walked into their apartment, Sarah set down her bag, turned to her son, and pulled him into a fierce hug. "You did it," she whispered. "You brilliant, amazing boy. You saved us." "We did it, Mom," Marcus corrected. "You were the one standing up there. You were the one fighting. I just helped you see what was already there." That night, they ordered pizza, a luxury they couldn't afford but needed anyway. They sat at the kitchen table, not working on legal documents for the first time in months, just eating and talking and laughing. Sarah's phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer but decided to take the call. "Miss Martinez, this is Davidson from the Chicago Legal Aid Society. I was in the courtroom today observing your hearing. I wanted to reach out because our organization would like to offer you pro bono legal assistance for the remainder of your case." Sarah's breath caught. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. What you've accomplished representing yourself is extraordinary, but you shouldn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We'd like to help." After she hung up, Sarah relayed the conversation to Marcus. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like they might actually be okay. The weeks following the hearing brought changes Sarah hadn't dared to imagine. The Legal Aid Society assigned her an attorney named Patricia Williams, a veteran civil rights lawyer who reviewed the case files with increasing outrage at what Chicago Family Medical had done. "They targeted you specifically," Patricia explained during their first meeting. "Single mother, limited resources, minority status. They thought you'd be easy to intimidate into settling. They never expected you to fight back, much less expose their fraud." The turning point came 6 weeks after the explosive hearing. Patricia filed a comprehensive motion to dismiss with prejudice, including a request for sanctions against Chicago Family Medical and their attorneys for fraudulent conduct. Chicago Family Medical's response was weak, evasive, and ultimately unconvincing. Their lawyers, no longer including Jennifer Morrison, who'd withdrawn from the case, argued that the omissions were oversights rather than intentional fraud, but the documented pattern made that defense untenable. Judge Anderson scheduled a final hearing. When the judge entered, his expression was stern. He'd clearly spent significant time reviewing every document, every argument, every piece of evidence. "I've considered the motions before me carefully," he began. "This case represents one of the most troubling examples of litigation abuse I've encountered in my years on the bench. Chicago Family Medical, through their counsel, filed a lawsuit against Miss Martinez knowing that the damages they claimed were substantially the same as losses they'd already recovered through a state settlement. They targeted a vulnerable defendant, concealed material facts from this court, and used the judicial system as a weapon to extort money from someone they believed couldn't fight back." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. Chicago Family Medical is ordered to pay Miss Martinez $50,000 in sanctions to compensate for the emotional distress, financial hardship, and time lost defending against a fraudulent claim. I'm also referring this matter to the Illinois State Bar for investigation into the conduct of the attorneys involved." Sarah felt her knees go weak. $50,000, enough to pay the back rent, catch up on bills, give them breathing room. More than money, though, it was acknowledgement. Vindication. Justice. Furthermore, the judge continued, I want to address something unusual about this case. Miss Martinez represented herself through complex litigation and exposed fraud that experienced attorneys perpetrated. Her work was exemplary, but it's clear she had assistance from her son, a 12-year-old child who demonstrated legal analytical abilities far beyond his years. Judge Anderson looked directly at Marcus. Young man, what you've done is remarkable, but it's also deeply troubling that you had to do it. A child shouldn't have to become a legal expert to protect his family from a corrupt system. The fact that you did speaks both to your extraordinary abilities and to the failures of our justice system to protect vulnerable people. He paused. I'm directing the court administrator to work with legal aid organizations to create a better process for pro-se defendants facing complex litigation. What happened here, a single mother forced to defend herself against well-funded corporate attorneys, should never happen again. And while I'm grateful you were able to help your mother, no child should have to carry that burden. As the judge struck his gavel for the final time, the courtroom erupted in applause. Sarah turned to Marcus and pulled him close, both of them crying as months of fear and pressure and exhaustion finally released. Patricia hugged them both. You did it. You actually did it. That evening, back at their apartment, Sarah and Marcus sat at the kitchen table one last time with legal documents spread before them. But this time, they were packing them away. It's over, Sarah said, still not quite believing it. It's really over. It's over, Marcus confirmed. They boxed up the files, the exhibits, the timelines and charts and research notes that had consumed their lives. Sarah felt like she could finally breathe. What do you want to do now? She asked her son. Right now, tonight. What do you want to do? Marcus thought for a moment, then smiled. Can we watch a movie? Like normal people? Not a documentary about law or trials. Just a regular movie. Sarah laughed, the sound surprised and joyful. We can watch whatever you want. They settled on the couch with popcorn, another luxury they could finally afford, and turned on a silly comedy that had nothing to do with courts or justice or fighting systems. For the first time in months, they were just a mother and son spending an evening together. And it was perfect. 6 months later, Sarah and Marcus were invited back to the courthouse for a special recognition from the Illinois State Bar Association. The courtroom was filled with people celebrating them. Judge Anderson spoke from the bench. In my 3 decades as a judge, I've rarely seen courage and determination like what Miss Martinez and her son demonstrated. He looked directly at them. You were outmatched by every measure. You had no legal training, no resources, no support. You faced seasoned attorneys backed by a wealthy client. By every prediction you should have lost. But you didn't lose. You won because you refused to accept injustice. You won because you learned the law and fought with intelligence and integrity. You won because a remarkable young man decided his mother deserved better. The audience applauded. More importantly, you exposed fraud that had harmed multiple people and would have harmed many more. Your refusal to settle, your insistence on truth, led to investigations that are changing corporate accountability. You didn't just save yourselves, you saved others. They presented Sarah with a plaque and commendation. But then Judge Anderson stepped down from the bench and approached Marcus directly. Young man, I want you to understand something important, he said, kneeling to eye level. What you did was extraordinary, but you should never have had to do it. A 12-year-old shouldn't have to become a legal expert to protect his family. That's a system failure, not a success story. The judge's voice was gentle but firm. As you decide what to do with your remarkable gifts, remember that the goal isn't to make more children into what you had to become. The goal is to fix the system so no child has to sacrifice their childhood to get justice for their family. After the ceremony, a young woman approached them hesitantly, clutching a folder of legal documents. Miss Martinez, my name is Angela. I'm being sued by my former employer for something I didn't do. They're trying to blame me for their accounting errors. I can't afford a lawyer, and I've been so scared. But I saw the news story about you, and I thought maybe I could fight too. Sarah looked at this woman, young, terrified, holding papers she barely understood, and saw herself 6 months ago. She saw every person who'd ever been crushed by a system that favored money over truth. She took Angela's hands. You can fight. And you don't have to fight alone. She gave Angela Patricia's contact information, connected her with the legal aid resources that were now available, shared the templates and research strategies that had saved her own case. As they finally left the courthouse, Marcus looked up at his mother. Are we going to help her? Like, actually help her prepare her case if she wants our help? Yes. We know things now that could help other people. Why wouldn't we share that? They walked through the courthouse doors into afternoon sunshine. The building that had once represented everything frightening and incomprehensible now felt different. Not friendly exactly, but navigable. Understandable. A place where justice was possible if you knew how to fight for it. Mom, Marcus said as they walked toward the bus stop. I've been thinking about what the judge said. About fixing the system instead of making more kids like me. Yeah? I think I want to do both. I want to be a lawyer someday, but not the kind who uses the law to hurt people. I want to be the kind who helps people like us. People who get targeted because the system thinks they're easy victims. People who deserve justice but can't afford to buy it. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her son. He'd grown taller in the past months, his face losing some of its childhood softness, his eyes holding that serious, thoughtful expression she knew so well. But there was something new there too, hope, purpose, a vision of who he might become. Then ULL continued 5:50 am an incredible lawyer, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Because you'll remember what it feels like to be on the other side. You'll remember what it costs when justice is only available to people who can afford it. You'll remember being 12 years old and carrying the weight of your mother's survival on your shoulders. And that will make you fight harder for every person who walks into your office, terrified and alone. They stood at the bus stop, waiting in comfortable silence. The bus arrived, and they climbed on board. As they took their seats, Sarah glanced at Marcus, who was looking out the window with a slight smile. What are you thinking about? She asked. I'm thinking that for the first time in months, we don't have to prepare for a court hearing. We can just go home and be normal. He grinned. What do you want to do tonight? Homework, he said. And they both laughed at the absurdity of homework being the relaxing option. And maybe pizza again. And we could watch another movie. Sounds perfect. For the first time in either of their lives, the future felt open rather than crushing, full of possibility rather than dread. They'd fought the system and won. They'd exposed fraud and changed policies. They'd proven that justice wasn't just for the wealthy. But more importantly, they'd survived together, and they'd emerged stronger, more resilient, more certain of their own worth. Sarah realized something profound. She'd spent years feeling like she was failing her son, like her poverty and struggles were harming him, like she wasn't enough. Like every eviction notice, every court appearance, every night of tears she thought he couldn't hear was proof of her inadequacy as a mother. But she'd been wrong. Her determination had taught him courage. Her refusal to give up had shown him resilience. Her fight for truth had instilled in him an unshakable sense of justice. Her willingness to stand alone against impossible odds had shown him that one person could make a difference. She hadn't failed him. She'd built him. And together they'd built something bigger than either of them alone, proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. Proof that intelligence didn't require expensive degrees, that justice didn't belong only to the wealthy, that a mother's love and a child's brilliance could move mountains. The courthouse disappeared behind them as the bus turned the corner. Sarah took Marcus's hand and squeezed it gently. Neither of them felt small anymore.